All right, I'm back. Here we are working on my 1975 Ford Bronco. Now in the last video, what we did was we disassembled the whole front end basically. And now what we're going to do is put our new bushings in and rebuild everything. First thing we're going to do is put the track arm bushings in. Now if it's warm out and you're doing this, it's going to be really tough because those bushings have expanded from the heat. But I looked out and it was freezing cold in my garage. I've heard people recommend dremeling down the edges so that it slides in easier. For me, I put it back together, tightened it down with a vise, and then it stayed. It was pretty easy. Then we're going to install the axle wedges. What I did was I covered these things in grease so they could move around a bunch. First I put the caps on, and then I put the radius arm and just stuck some bolts in there to hold it in place. Also, what I did was I pivoted my axle so it was pointing down so that the radius arms could kind of rest on the floor so it was easier to hold it in place. I followed James Duff instructions that come with the install kit, and I put in the bolts without any of the lock washers first to get it tightened down, and then I'd take the bolts out, put the lock washers on, and tighten it back down. Now, this is where a lot of people deal with Bronco lean. And so this is what I did to make sure that everything was level. First, I took a 4-foot level, set it on my bumper, and found out what was level. So what I did was I jacked the axle back up, which lifted the radius arms into place, put that 4-foot level over both radius arms, and made sure that it matched the level that was on the bumper. A lot of people will lower the axle down so that the radius arms actually try to touch the floor evenly. You could do that. I thought a 4-foot level was a little bit better idea to make sure that I was right on. It took me a couple tries to get it exactly right, but all you do is loosen the bolts on the axle, wiggle it around a little bit, and tighten them back down. Then I put the radius arms back in those tiny little holes that are underneath the passenger and driver's side floorboards. This had to be the hardest part of putting this whole thing back together. Trying to get it in the hole was one of the hardest things, that's what she said, because you had to get the angle just right, and you're moving your whole axle while you're doing this. So I put my jack under the pumpkin on my axle, and I was moving that thing around to try to get the radius arm to go through the hole. As soon as I did, I pulled it as tight as I could, put the other bushing on the other side, and then you're looking at that thing, and the bushing is flush with the radius arm. There's no way you're going to get that nut on there, especially with the washer. And if you look at the nut that holds the radius arm in place, there's no threads that start on the side of the nut that you're supposed to thread on. So what I did was I turned the nut around backwards, started tightening it down so that the bushings went into that hole and gave me more room. Then I untightened it, put the washer on, and then tighten it down the right way. Then, very important, don't forget your cotter pins. I kept forgetting to put those in. I would want to move on. Don't forget your cotter pins. Then hop on over to the other side, do the same thing. Whatever side you start on is going to be easier than the other side, because when you're putting it in and you already have one in place, the axle doesn't want to move at that point. It doesn't want to budge anywhere. I would be pulling on it, and I'd put my legs up on the axle and be moving it with my legs while I was pulling. It took me about 3 hours to get the thing back together. At this point, you want to put your brake lines back in. Again, I didn't take my brake lines out. Everything worked pretty well, but I had to keep my axle jacked up, and I had to keep everything from pulling too hard on the brake lines. Then what you're going to do is you're going to put your springs back in. Start with the spring cups, put those in. Get your spring in and screw it in place around the spring cups. And then what you're going to do is you're going to raise or lower your axle so that it fits right in place without any pressure on it. Then, I'm sorry I don't have great footage of this. There's not a great way to get a camera in there. But what you're going to do is you're going to screw in the screw that points straight down. So there's one that goes like this and then another one that goes like this. Start with the one that goes straight down. So what I did was I tightened that one just enough so it grabbed onto the bracket. And then what I did was I had tons of wiggle room, but I tried to put the other screw in up top. They're really hard to get in at the same time. They don't want to go together, but I would recommend putting that one that's pointed straight down in first, and then put the other one in. And then you want to put your shocks in. There's a bolt that goes in the bottom, screw that in, and then you put a couple nuts on top. Next, we're going to install the tie rod and drag link. And if you remember from my first video, busted up the threads on my tie rod and drag link, so I had to get a new one. So I'm putting the link to the one that I bought in the comment section below. It was the one from Wild Horse. It actually had 3 different points of adjustment, which was more than the original one that I had that only had 1 point. When you're installing it, just make sure that you put everything back the same way. Screw the nuts on, don't forget the cotter pins. And then as soon as I had the drag link installed, I installed the steering stabilizer. After that, this is where it gets a little different than when you took it all apart. What you want to do is you want to put the tires back on, tighten them down, and then actually lower back down the Bronco. Then you'll put in your track bar. Track bar was a little tricky to get in. You want to make sure that you have everything lined up. What I did was I installed the side that was attached to my axle first, got that in, got it tightened down, and then installed the side that was connected to the frame. Now, it would probably be nice to have someone help you do this. I did it alone. I would get under there, wiggle it around, move the steering wheel one way or another to shift the axle to get it in place. Then I just took a rubber mallet, hammered it through, and it actually went in pretty easily. Then, last step, put your drive shaft back together. Do not over tighten those bolts. It's only about 12 foot-pounds of pressure. 12 pounds, 12 foot-pounds, 12 pounds of pressure. And then you're ready to go. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching, and remember, I'm not a mechanic, so if you screwed something up, that's your own fault. And feel free, leave comments below on how to do it better, because I'm not a mechanic.